Bullies slapped a disabled alien girl. An hour later, human veterans walked in. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. The incident occurred in the bustling central food court of Nexus Station, the largest interspecies trading hub in the Orion Arm. 17-year-old Valix stood frozen behind the counter of her family's cerulean cuisine stall, her 4 secondary limbs trembling uncontrollably, as they always did when she felt threatened. The towering draconid youth leaned across the counter, his scaled face twisted in a sneer. I said, "Where's the proper server? Not some twitchy little cripple." His 3 companions laughed, their eyes cold with cruel amusement. The central food court of Nexus Station had been Valix's sanctuary and prison for as long as she could remember, but never had she felt so trapped as she did now. Valix's condition was rare among her people. The neural pathways to her secondary limbs had been damaged during her difficult birth, leaving her with limited control over the delicate appendages most ceruleans used for intricate food preparation and artistic expression. Her family had been forced to flee their homeworld when trade sanctions made life impossible, finding refuge on this massive space station operated jointly by 27 different species. Here, they had opened their small food stall, serving traditional dishes to the countless travelers and residents who called Nexus home. "I am the server today," Valix managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper as her secondary arms continued their embarrassing dance at her sides. She forced herself to meet the draconid's gaze, though her natural instinct was to look away. "What would you like to order?" The tallest of the draconids, clearly their leader, made a theatrical display of reading the menu. "I'd like something that hasn't been touched by defective hands." His companions hooted with laughter, drawing the attention of nearby diners. Most looked away quickly, unwilling to get involved. Interspecies conflicts were common enough on Nexus, and station security was often slow to respond to minor incidents that didn't involve physical violence or property damage. Valix felt heat rise to her face, the blue pigment of her skin darkening with embarrassment. She'd endured comments before, but rarely so direct, so public, so deliberately cruel. Her parents were attending a supplier meeting on the lower levels. They wouldn't be back for hours. She was alone, and that knowledge emboldened her tormentors. "Our food is prepared according to all Nexus health regulations," she said, trying to sound firm despite the tremor in her voice. "If you don't wish to order, please step aside for other customers." Except there were no other customers waiting. The small crowd that had gathered was only there to watch the spectacle. The draconid's eyes narrowed. With alarming speed, his hand shot forward, knocking aside the display of prepared samples and sending them crashing to the floor. "Clumsy me," he said with mock concern. But then, accidents happen when freaks are allowed to serve food. Valix began to back away, but the counter blocked her escape. Instinctively, she raised her primary arms in a defensive gesture as the draconid's companions circled around to the service entrance of the stall. Their leader leaned in closer. "On Draconi's Prime, defectives like you are identified at birth and assigned to appropriate duties in the mines, where no one has to look at them," he hissed, his reptilian face now inches from hers. "You should be grateful we're simply educating you about your proper place." The slap came without warning, his scaled palm connecting with Valix's face with enough force to knock her against the prep station behind her. One of his friends grabbed her twitching secondary arms, mimicking their uncontrolled movements with exaggerated gestures that made the gathering crowd titter nervously. "Stop," Valix pleaded, tears welling in her eyes. "Please, just leave me alone." The draconid raised his hand again, but a new voice cut through the tense atmosphere. "That's quite enough." The voice belonged to a Medusan merchant from a nearby stall. Her serpentine hair appendages writhed with agitation as she approached. "Station security has been called. They'll be here shortly." It was a bluff. Valix could tell from the Medusan's nervous posture, but it was enough to make the draconids hesitate. Their leader hissed in annoyance. "We were just leaving anyway. This garbage they call food isn't worth our time." He leaned in one last time toward Valix. "We'll be back tomorrow. Maybe by then you'll have learned your place." With a final dismissive gesture, he knocked over a stack of serving containers before sauntering away with his cronies, their laughter echoing through the food court. The crowd dispersed quickly, no one meeting Velix's gaze. The Medusan merchant approached cautiously. "Are you all right, child? Should I call medical?" Velix shook her head, fighting back tears. "No, thank you for intervening. I'll be fine." But she wasn't fine. The side of her face stung, and worse than the physical pain was the humiliation. For a brief, terrible moment, she wondered if the Draconid was right. Perhaps there was something fundamentally wrong with her, something that meant she didn't deserve to occupy public space like normal people. The Medusan looked unconvinced but nodded. "If you're sure. I've seen those young thugs before. Their parents are diplomats or traitors. They think the rules don't apply to them." She helped Velix clean up the mess before returning to her own stall. Alone again, Velix slumped against the back wall, sliding down until she sat on the floor, her trembling secondary arms wrapped around her body in a futile attempt at self-comfort. The tears came then, hot and bitter. She would have to tell her parents when they returned, and she dreaded seeing the familiar mix of anger, pity, and helplessness in their eyes. They had sacrificed everything to give her a chance at a normal life, but moments like this made her wonder if such a thing was ever possible for someone like her. Little did Velix know that her encounter hadn't gone entirely unnoticed. At a table in the far corner of the food court, 3 humans had witnessed the entire incident. They had been quietly sharing a meal, enjoying their first day of shore leave after 6 months aboard the US Dauntless. Now, their faces were grim as they exchanged glances. Staff Sergeant Malik Johnson set down his coffee mug with deliberate care. At 42, with multiple combat deployments behind him, he'd seen enough bullying in his lifetime to recognize it in any species. Beside him, Chief Petty Officer Dana Rodriguez's hand had tightened around her fork until her knuckles turned white. The youngest of their group, Corporal Ethan Cole, was already half out of his seat, his expression thunderous. "Sit down, Cole," Johnson said quietly. "Not yet. You saw what they did, Sarge," Cole protested, his voice tight with anger. "We can't just—" "I said, not yet," Johnson repeated, his tone brooking no argument. "We do this right, or we don't do it at all." He turned to Rodriguez. "Dana, what's the read on those Draconids? Background, likely habits." Rodriguez, who had served as an intelligence specialist before transferring to the diplomatic security detail, considered the question. "Young males, probably late adolescents. Based on their clothing and jewelry, they're from affluent families, diplomatic corps, or merchant class. Their kind tend to be territorial, establishing routines. If they said they'll be back tomorrow, they meant it." Johnson nodded, the beginnings of a plan forming in his mind. "Then we have some time to prepare? First, we need more information." He glanced over at the cerulean girl, who was now struggling to compose herself as she cleaned up the mess the Draconids had left. "Cole, you're up. Go buy something from her stall. Be friendly, but not too friendly. Don't mention what happened unless she does. Just gather intel." Cole nodded, understanding the assignment. As the youngest and least intimidating of their group, he was the natural choice for this part of the mission. "What about station security?" he asked. Johnson's expression hardened. "Based on what we just saw, I wouldn't count on them. But we'll do this by the book, as much as possible." He didn't need to elaborate. All 3 of them had served in enough trouble spots across human and alien space to know that official justice systems didn't always serve everyone equally. As Cole made his way toward the cerulean's food stall, Rodriguez leaned toward Johnson. "You know this could cause an incident. If those kids are connected like I think they are." "I know," Johnson interrupted. "But some things transcend politics and regulations." He met her gaze steadily. "We've all lost too much to stand by and watch this happen. Besides, who said anything about causing an incident? We're just going to have a civilized conversation tomorrow." Rodriguez's lips curved in a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Of course, Sarge. Just a civilized conversation." Across the food court, Cole approached Velix's stall with a carefully casual demeanor. The young cerulean had managed to restore order to her workspace, though her eyes remained downcast, and her secondary arms continued to twitch and tremble. "Hey there," Cole said, keeping his voice gentle. "I've been wanting to try some cerulean food since I got to the station. What would you recommend for a first-timer?" Velix looked up, surprise momentarily replacing the shame and fear in her large, luminous eyes. She hadn't expected any customers after the scene the Draconids had caused. especially not a human. Their kind were still relatively rare on Nexus Station. We have several dishes that humans generally find palatable, she said, making a visible effort to speak professionally despite her trembling limbs. Our sweet spice rolls are popular, or perhaps a bowl of crescent soup? Cole smiled, pretending not to notice her distress. Both sound great. I'll take one of each. As Valix began preparing his order, he added conversationally, I'm Ethan, by the way. Just got shore leave from the Dauntless. I'm Valix, she replied, her secondary hands working with surprising dexterity despite their trembling as she assembled his meal. You're military then? Marine Corps, Cole confirmed. First time on Nexus. It's quite a place. Valix handed him the food, accepting his payment with a slight nod. It has its moments, good and bad. I hope you enjoy your stay and your meal. Cole hesitated, weighing Johnson's instructions against his own instincts. Listen, about what happened earlier. Please, Valix cut him off, her voice tight. I'd rather not discuss it. Cole nodded, respecting her wishes. I understand. Just wanted to say that not everyone on this station thinks like those guys. He took his food and added casually, my friends and I come here often. We'll probably see you around. It wasn't true, of course. They'd only arrived on the station yesterday, but the message was clear enough. She wasn't alone. Cole returned to his companions, setting down his purchases on their table. Well, Johnson asked. Her name is Valix, Cole reported quietly. She's understandably shaken up. Didn't want to talk about what happened. Johnson nodded. Not surprising. What else? She's got skill, despite her condition, Cole said, gesturing to the perfectly prepared food. Those tremors don't stop her from doing her job. Rodriguez was already accessing information on her personal device. Ceruleans, she read. Highly communal species, six-limbed humanoids. Known for their artistic and culinary traditions. Their secondary arms are specialized for fine manipulative tasks. She looked up. A neural disorder affecting those limbs would be particularly devastating in their culture. Explains why those draconid punks targeted her specifically, Johnson said grimly. Maximum psychological impact. He'd seen similar tactics used in warfare, attacking not just the body, but the identity and dignity of the target. Cole took a bite of his food, his eyes widening in surprise. This is actually really good, he said. Focus, Marine, Johnson admonished, though there was no real heat in his words. What's our next move? Rodriguez had been continuing her research. Those draconids, based on their markings and scale patterns, they're likely from the ruling caste. If they're who I think they are, their parents are part of the trade delegation. Diplomatic immunity. Johnson's expression darkened. Of course they are. He was silent for a moment, then seemed to come to a decision. We proceed as planned. Tomorrow, we return, in uniform. Full dress. Cole and Rodriguez exchanged glances. Full dress uniforms, mint medals, campaign ribbons, the works. It was a statement. Are you sure that's wise, Sarge? Rodriguez asked. The brass won't like us drawing attention. Johnson's smile was cold. Who said anything about drawing attention? We're just three veterans enjoying the local cuisine. If we happen to be there when those draconids return, well, that's just a coincidence. As they finished their meal, making plans for the following day, none of them noticed the small security drone hovering near the ceiling of the food court, its camera focused on their table. On the security deck 6 levels below, a Nexus security officer watched the footage with interest, making note of the human's conversation before flagging it for review by her superior. The wheels of several different agendas had been set in motion, all revolving around a trembling cerulean girl who had never wanted to be the center of any conflict. The following morning, Valix approached her family's food stall with dread pooling in her stomach. She had told her parents about the incident when they returned from their meeting, downplaying the physical confrontation but unable to hide the damage to their inventory. Her father had been furious, vowing to file a complaint with station security, while her mother had simply held her close, her own secondary arms enveloping Valix in a gesture of protection and comfort that made her feel like a child again. But complaints rarely led to action, especially against the privileged. Valix knew this from bitter experience. 3 cycles ago, a drunken Phasian trader had smashed their displays and called her vile names before station security finally responded. The official report had classified it as a cultural misunderstanding, and no charges were filed. Her parents couldn't afford to antagonize potential customers or the station authorities. Their residence permit was already on thin ice after 2 consecutive quarters of declining revenue. So here she was, opening the stall alone again while her parents met with their financial advisor to discuss their dwindling options. Valix worked methodically, preparing ingredients and setting up displays with practiced efficiency despite the constant trembling of her secondary limbs. She had long ago learned to adapt, using her primary arms for stability while her secondary ones handled more delicate tasks in short, controlled bursts of activity. As she worked, Valix found herself scanning the food court anxiously, looking for any sign of the draconids from yesterday. Each time a customer approached, she tensed, only relaxing marginally when it proved to be someone else. The constant vigilance was exhausting, but she couldn't help it. Their promise to return had haunted her dreams all night. 2 hours into her shift, business was slower than usual. Word had spread about yesterday's incident, and many regular customers were giving the stall a wide berth, not wanting to get caught in any potential conflict. Valix tried not to feel hurt by this. It was simply practical for them, but the isolation stung nonetheless. Just before the midday rush, she spotted them, the 4 draconids entering the food court from the main concourse. They moved with the same arrogant swagger as before, scaling bodies rippling with barely contained aggression as they spotted her. Valix felt her breathing quicken, her secondary arms beginning to spasm more violently as adrenaline flooded her system. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. She briefly considered calling security herself, but what would be the point? By the time they arrived, if they bothered to come at all, the damage would be done. The draconids approached her stall with deliberate slowness, clearly enjoying her discomfort. Their leader, the one who had slapped her, leaned against the counter just as he had the day before. Well, he said, his voice pitched to carry to the nearby tables. The defective is still here. I'm disappointed. I thought perhaps you'd learned your lesson about contaminating public spaces with your presence. Valix said nothing, keeping her eyes downcast as she had been taught. Show submission, avoid provocation, basic survival tactics for the vulnerable in any society. The draconid was undeterred by her silence. Nothing to say? Perhaps your speech center is as damaged as your limbs. He turned to his companions. Should we help her understand her place more clearly today? One of his friends laughed. Maybe we should order something and then send it back. Show everyone how unsanitary her preparation methods are. An excellent idea, the leader agreed, turning back to Valix with malicious intent clear in his eyes. I'll have. Excuse me, gentlemen. Is this line moving? The voice was calm, authoritative, and distinctly human. Valix looked up in surprise. There, standing directly behind the draconids, were 3 humans in crisp military uniforms. She recognized the younger one as Ethan from yesterday, but he seemed different now. Taller, somehow, and far more imposing in his dress blues with rows of ribbons and medals across his chest. Beside him stood an older human male, dark-skinned with close-cropped gray hair and eyes that seemed to miss nothing, and a human female with her black hair pulled back in a severe bun, her expression coolly professional. The draconids turned, clearly annoyed at the interruption. Their leader's eyes narrowed as he took in the human's appearance. Find another stall, humans. We're conducting business here. The older human, Staff Sergeant Malik Johnson, though Valix didn't know his name yet, smiled thinly. Interesting. It didn't look like business to me. In fact, it looked remarkably like harassment. The draconid scales flushed a darker red, a sign of anger in his species. This doesn't concern you. This is between us and the defective. Johnson stepped forward, closing the distance between them until he was almost toe-to-toe with the draconid. Despite being shorter by at least 6 inches, there was something about his posture that made him seem like the more dangerous of the two. See, that's where you're wrong, Johnson said, his voice still conversational though there was steel beneath it now. When I see 4 healthy young men ganging up on someone half their size, it becomes my concern. He glanced at Valix, then back to the draconid, especially when it's happening 2 days in a row. The draconid's companions shifted uncomfortably, but their leader stood his ground. You have no authority here, human. Do you know who my father is? No, Johnson replied evenly. And I don't particularly care. By now, a small crowd was gathering, sensing the tension. From her vantage point behind the counter, Valix could see station security officers at the far end of the food court, watching but not intervening. The sight filled her with a familiar resignation. They wouldn't help unless things escalated to actual violence, and maybe not even then. The female human, Chief Petty Officer Dana Rodriguez, stepped forward to stand beside Johnson. Perhaps we should introduce ourselves properly, she suggested, her tone deceptively pleasant. Staff Sergeant Malik Johnson, United Earth Marines, retired after 22 years of service. 3 Purple Hearts, 2 Silver Stars, and the Navy Cross. She nodded toward herself. Chief Petty Officer Dana Rodriguez, Naval Intelligence, 15 years of service, including 3 combat deployments. She gestured to the younger human. Corporal Ethan Cole, Marine Scout Sniper, 8 years of service. Distinguished Marksman Medal and the Bronze Star with Valor Device. The Draconid leader snorted dismissively. Am I supposed to be impressed by your primitive military decorations? Not at all, Johnson replied. Just thought you should know who you're dealing with. His smile remained fixed, but there was something in his eyes that made even the Draconid hesitate. Now, I believe you were about to order something from this young lady's establishment. The Draconid glanced back at Valix, then at his friends, clearly weighing his options. The crowd had grown larger, and many had their communication devices out, recording the confrontation. Finally, pride won out over caution. We don't want anything from a defective, he spat. And we don't take orders from humans. You should remember your place in the galactic community. You're newcomers, barely civilized. Johnson didn't react to the provocation. Instead, he turned slightly to address the crowd. Interesting perspective. I wonder if anyone here shares it. His voice carried easily through the food court. In human culture, we have a saying, the measure of a society is found in how it treats its most vulnerable members. The Draconid's face contorted with rage. How dare you lecture me about culture? Your species was still huddling in caves when mine was reaching for the stars. And yet here we are, Rodriguez interjected smoothly, standing between you and a young woman who's just trying to do her job. The standoff might have continued, but at that moment, Cole stepped forward, deliberately placing himself between the Draconids and Valix's stall. I'll have another order of those sweet spice rolls, he said loudly, addressing Valix directly. They were delicious yesterday. This simple action, treating Valix as a normal person worthy of respect, seemed to infuriate the Draconid leader more than any direct confrontation. With a hiss of frustration, he shoved Cole aside, or tried to. The young Marine didn't budge, his combat boots planted firmly on the deck. That, Johnson said quietly, was a mistake. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Where the 3 humans had been merely imposing before, now they radiated a controlled readiness that Valix had never witnessed. It wasn't aggression, exactly, but the absolute certainty that they were prepared for whatever came next. Cole didn't retaliate for the attempted shove. He simply looked at the Draconid with an expression of such icy calm that the alien took an involuntary step back. Last chance, Johnson announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. Walk away now, and we can all pretend this never happened. For a tense moment, it seemed like the Draconid might escalate further. His clawed hands flexed, and his scales flushed an even deeper red. But a look passed between him and his companions, a moment of uncertainty, of recalculation. Whatever they saw in the humans' faces gave them pause. This isn't over, the Draconid leader snarled, but there was less conviction in his voice now. Come on, he said to his friends. Let's find somewhere less contaminated to eat. With a final glare at Valix and the humans, he turned and stalked away, his companions following reluctantly. The crowd parted to let them pass, many openly recording the Draconid's retreat on their devices. As they disappeared down the concourse, a collective exhalation seemed to pass through the food court. The security officers who had been watching from a distance finally approached, but Johnson intercepted them before they could reach Valix's stall. Just a minor disagreement over queue etiquette, he told them with a disarming smile. All resolved now. The lead officer, a Tritonian with translucent skin that revealed the complex network of blood vessels beneath, looked skeptical. We have reports of a potential interspecies incident. Rodriguez stepped forward, her diplomatic training evident in her poised response. A misunderstanding, nothing more. We apologize for any disruption. After a few more questions, the security team withdrew, though they remained within sight, monitoring the situation. Meanwhile, Cole had turned back to Valix, who stood frozen behind her counter, her secondary arms trembling violently from the stress of the encounter. "I really would like those sweet spice rolls," he said gently. "If you're still serving." His simple request broke through her shock. "Yes, of course," Valix managed, her voice unsteady as she began to prepare his order. "Thank you for intervening." By now, Johnson and Rodriguez had joined Cole at the counter. "No need for thanks," Johnson said, his voice warm now, all traces of the dangerous edge gone. "We take care of our own." Valix looked up, confused. "But I'm not human." Rodriguez smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her serious face. "Doesn't matter. Some principles are universal." As Valix handed Cole his order, she noticed something unexpected. Customers were beginning to line up behind the humans. The same people who had avoided her stall earlier were now approaching, some with curious expressions, others with what appeared to be newfound respect. "Looks like business is picking up," Johnson observed. "Mind if we stick around for a while? We'd like to try more of your menu." Valix felt a strange sensation spreading through her chest, a warmth she hadn't experienced in a long time. It took her a moment to recognize it as hope. "I'd like that," she said softly, her secondary arms still trembling, but somehow the movements seemed less shameful now. "I'd like that very much." The three humans took up positions at a table directly in front of her stall, their uniforms and medals catching the light as they sampled her cooking and engaged her in conversation during lulls in service. Their presence drew attention, and with it, customers. By midday, Valix was busier than she had been in weeks. Word spread quickly through Nexus Station about the confrontation. By the time Valix's parents returned from their meeting, the food court was buzzing with activity, their stall at the center of it. They found their daughter working confidently despite her condition, serving a diverse crowd of customers, while three uniformed humans kept a watchful eye from nearby. As her father approached, confusion evident on his face, Valix straightened with newfound dignity. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt something other than shame about her place in the universe. The trembling in her secondary limbs continued. It always would, but now it seemed less like a defect and more like simply another part of who she was. "Father," she said, a new steadiness in her voice, "I'd like you to meet some friends." The confrontation in the food court had just been the beginning. News of the incident spread across Nexus Station with the speed only possible in a closed environment where entertainment options were limited and gossip was currency. By evening, the story had evolved with each retelling. In some versions, the humans had physically thrown the draconids across the food court. In others, they had drawn weapons. The truth was far less dramatic, but perhaps more profound. Three veterans had simply stood their ground against bullying, using nothing more than their presence and words. For Valix and her family, the immediate aftermath was overwhelming. Their stall, which had been struggling for months, suddenly became the busiest in the food court. Customers from a dozen different species lined up to sample their food, many openly expressing support or curiosity about the now famous confrontation. Valix's parents were bewildered by the change, but grateful for the increased revenue. The three humans, Johnson, Rodriguez, and Cole, had stayed for several hours, helping manage the unexpected rush while deflecting questions about their involvement. Before they left, Johnson had pressed a small device into Valix's hand. "Direct communication line," he explained quietly. "If those draconids or anyone else gives you trouble, call us. Immediately." "Why are you doing this?" Valix had asked, genuinely confused by their continued interest in her welfare. "You don't even know me." Johnson's expression had turned solemn. "Where we come from, we have a history of looking the other way when the vulnerable were targeted. It led to some dark chapters in human history. We've learned that sometimes, all it takes to prevent cruelty is for a few people to stand up and say no more." Rodriguez had added, "Besides, we're here for another 2 weeks of shore leave. We need somewhere good to eat." Her matter-of-fact tone had made Valix smile despite her lingering anxiety. Now, as Valix and her parents closed the stall for the night, the events of the day seemed almost dreamlike. Her father, Tavex, carefully counted the day's earnings, nearly triple their usual take. "This could be the break we've been waiting for," he said, hope creeping into his voice for the first time in months. "If business continues like this, we might be able to afford the medical consultation on Centauri Prime." Valix stiffened. The consultation, a specialist who claimed to have developed a new neural regeneration technique that might help control her tremors, had been a distant dream for years, always just beyond their financial reach. She had stopped allowing herself to hope for it. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves," her mother, Leary, cautioned. "One good day doesn't solve everything." But even she couldn't hide the optimism in her voice. As they made their way back to their small living quarters in the residential section of the station, Valix felt a strange mixture of emotions. Relief at having survived another encounter with the Draconids. Gratitude toward the humans who had intervened. But beneath it all, a nagging worry. What would happen when the veterans left the station? Would the Draconids return, more vengeful than before? And why had she become the focal point of what was clearly becoming a larger conflict? She didn't have to wait long for answers. The following morning, as they prepared to open the stall, a station official appeared, a tall, severe Axlosian whose gelatinous form was contained within an environment suit. He introduced himself as Administrator K.L. Vec, Department of Commercial Licensing. "We've received a formal complaint," he announced without preamble, his translator rendering his burbling speech into flattened standard. "Allegations of unsafe food handling practices and violation of health codes." Valix's father stepped forward protectively. "That's absurd. We've passed every inspection. Our ratings are exemplary." The administrator's expression was unreadable behind his faceplate. "Nevertheless, regulations require an immediate investigation of all formal complaints. Your stall will remain closed until this matter is resolved." "This is about yesterday, isn't it?" Valix found herself speaking up, surprising both her parents and herself. "The Draconids are retaliating because they were embarrassed." K.L. Vec's upper appendages rippled in what might have been discomfort. "The identity of complainants is confidential. This is merely procedural." "How long will the investigation take?" Leary asked, her secondary arms moving in agitated patterns that Valix recognized as extreme stress. "Difficult to say. Perhaps a week. Perhaps longer." The administrator's tone suggested he knew exactly how devastating this news was to a small business operating on thin margins. "Until then, your license is suspended." As he turned to leave, Valix felt a surge of desperation. "Please," she called after him. "This stall is all we have. We can't survive a week without income." Kielvek paused, then spoke without turning around. "Perhaps you should have considered that before becoming involved in interspecies incidents that reflect poorly on Nexus Station's reputation as a neutral trade hub." The message was clear. This wasn't about health codes. It was punishment for drawing attention, for disrupting the carefully maintained illusion of harmony that kept commerce flowing smoothly through the station. After the administrator left, Valix and her parents stood in stunned silence. All the hope from yesterday evaporated in an instant, replaced by the cold reality of station politics. The Draconids' parents clearly had influence, and they were using it. "What do we do now?" Valix whispered, her secondary arms wrapped around herself in a self-soothing gesture. Her father's expression hardened. "We fight this. We'll file an appeal, demand an expedited inspection." "With what resources?" her mother interrupted, always the practical one. "The appeal fee alone is more than we made yesterday. And without character witnesses or influence of our own, it would be denied anyway." They were trapped in a familiar vice, too marginalized to fight the system, too invested to walk away. Valix felt the familiar weight of guilt settling on her shoulders. If she weren't defective, if she hadn't drawn the Draconids' attention, if she had just endured their abuse silently instead of allowing the humans to intervene. The communication device Johnson had given her felt heavy in her pocket. Should she contact them? Would they even care about this new development, or had their intervention been merely a momentary diversion during their shore leave? Before she could decide, her parents were ushering her away from the stall. "Come," her father said quietly. "There's nothing more we can do here today." We need to conserve our resources and plan our next steps. As they walked back toward their quarters, Valix couldn't help noticing how other vendors avoided eye contact, how conversations stopped as they passed. The message was clear: association with them now carried risk. By sundown of the station's artificial day cycle, they would be effectively isolated. The communication device remained in her pocket and used. This was her family's burden to bear. They had survived worse since fleeing their homeworld. They would survive this too, somehow. What Valix didn't know was that news of the stall's closure was already reaching the 3 human veterans. Cole had returned to the food court for breakfast, only to find the cerulean stall shuttered and a notice of suspension prominently displayed. It hadn't taken him long to piece together what had happened. By midday, Johnson, Rodriguez, and Cole were gathered in their temporary quarters, discussing their options. Unlike Valix and her family, they weren't without resources or influence, but they were outsiders on Nexus, and any action they took could have diplomatic repercussions. This is retaliation, plain and simple, Cole argued, pacing the small room. We can't just let it stand. Rodriguez was more cautious. We need to be smart about this. The Draconids clearly have administrative connections. If we push too hard, we could make things worse for Valix and her family. Johnson had been quiet, staring at his personal terminal where he'd been researching Nexus Station's regulatory structure. There's another angle here, he said finally. This isn't just about some spoiled Draconid kids and a cerulean family. There's something bigger at play. He turned the screen so the others could see it. 3 other non-affiliated vendors have been shut down in the past month on similar pretexts. All small operations, all owned by species from non-Concordat worlds. The Galactic Concordat was the dominant political alliance in this sector, comprising 7 major species including the Draconids. Earth and the cerulean homeworld were among those who had maintained neutrality rather than joining. You think it's systematic, Rodriguez said, her intelligence background helping her see the pattern. Economic pressure? Johnson nodded grimly. Classic tactic. Squeeze the independents until they either leave or accept protection from one of the major players. So what do we do? Cole asked, his youthful impatience evident. We can't fight the whole station administration. No, Johnson agreed, but we can fight this one case. And sometimes, one case is all it takes to expose a larger problem. He activated his communication device. Time to call in some favors. Meanwhile, across the station, the Draconid youths were being summoned to a private meeting with their parents. In a luxurious diplomatic suite far removed from the commercial sections, Krelvax, senior trade envoy of the Draconid Imperium, paced before his son and his friends, his tail lashing with barely controlled anger. Do you have any idea what you've done? He hissed. Your little amusement in the food court has created a diplomatic incident. His son, Drexel, slouched in his chair, affecting boredom though his scales had paled with anxiety. It was nothing, father. Just putting a defective in her place. How were we to know some human veterans would interfere? Ambassador Krelvax slammed his fist on the polished table, making the young Draconids jump. That nothing has been viewed over 3 million times on the interspecies networks. The humans are using it as propaganda. Evidence of Concordat species oppressing neutrals. He activated a holographic display, showing footage of the confrontation from multiple angles. Look at these comments. Beings across 50 systems are discussing how 3 human veterans stood up to Draconid bullies while station security did nothing. The diplomatic corps is in damage control mode. Drexel's friends looked genuinely alarmed now, but the young Draconid himself maintained his defiant posture. So what? We had the stall closed down. Problem solved. His father's expression shifted from anger to something worse, disappointment mixed with calculation. You truly don't understand, do you? That solution has only made things worse. Now there are allegations of administrative corruption and targeted harassment. He turned to address all 4 young Draconids. Listen carefully. The Imperium is at a critical juncture in negotiations with multiple neutral worlds, including Earth. The humans' unexpected intervention has turned this into a symbolic incident that's being watched closely by potential allies and rivals alike. Drexel finally seemed to grasp the gravity of the situation. What do you want us to do? His father's expression was cold. You've created this mess. Now you will help fix it, exactly as I instruct. And if you ever embarrass the Imperium like this again, I'll have you shipped back to the homeworld for remedial diplomatic training in the outer provinces. Understood. The young Draconids nodded, their earlier arrogance replaced by genuine fear. Whatever punishment their father had in mind, it was clear that their privileged position on Nexus Station hung in the balance. As these various forces mobilized, Valix and her family remained in their quarters, unaware of how their personal struggle had become a focal point for much larger political currents. All they knew was that their livelihood was in jeopardy, their future uncertain. Valix sat by the small viewport in their living area, staring out at the distant stars beyond the station's massive structure. Her secondary arms twitched and trembled as always, but she no longer tried to hide them. Something had changed within her since the humans had stood up for her, a small spark of defiance that refused to be extinguished. The communication device Johnson had given her sat on the table before her. After hours of indecision, she reached for it, her mind made up. Whatever came next, she would not face it alone. The device activated at her touch, connecting instantly. "Sergeant Johnson," she said when his holographic image appeared. "I need your help." By the following morning, a strategy was taking shape. Johnson, Rodriguez, and Cole had listened intently as Valix explained the situation with the station administrator in the closed stall. Rather than offering empty reassurances, they had asked detailed questions and taken notes, treating the matter with the same serious attention they would give a military operation. "It's not just about us," Valix had explained, her confidence growing as she spoke. "There are other vendors who've been targeted as well, all small operations, all from non-Concordat worlds." Johnson had nodded, unsurprised. "We've noticed the pattern. This goes beyond simple bullying. It's economic intimidation with political undertones." Now, as they gathered in the humans' quarters to finalize their plan, Valix was struck by the methodical way they approached the problem. Rodriguez had compiled data on station regulations and appeal procedures, identifying potential leverage points and allies. Cole had been quietly gathering testimonials from other vendors and station residents who had witnessed the original confrontation with the Draconids. Johnson, meanwhile, had been making calls, lots of them. To Valix's surprise, some of these calls had reached high-ranking human officials stationed throughout the sector. "I don't understand," she said, her secondary arms moving in a pattern that indicated confusion. "Why would these important humans care about a small food stall?" Johnson smiled. "Because it's not just about your stall. It's about principles. Equal application of regulations. Fair treatment of neutral world citizens. These are core diplomatic issues for Earth." And, Rodriguez added, "because the footage of those Draconids harassing you has gone viral across multiple networks. Public opinion is squarely on your side." Valix was stunned. "Viral? You mean people are watching what happened?" Cole nodded, showing her a display of various media feeds. 3 million views and counting. The contrast between your situation and the Draconids' behavior struck a chord. Turns out, lots of species have experienced similar treatment from Concordat officials. For the first time, Valix began to understand how her personal humiliation had become something larger, a symbol that resonated beyond her individual experience. The realization was both terrifying and oddly empowering. "What exactly are we going to do?" she asked, ready to take an active role rather than remain a passive victim. Johnson outlined the plan. "First, we file a formal appeal against the closure. That's already in process. But the real strategy is two-pronged. Rodriguez will work through official channels, using her diplomatic connections to request a formal review of the situation. Meanwhile, Cole continued, "I'll coordinate with sympathetic media to keep attention on the case. Public scrutiny is our best weapon against administrative corruption." "And me?" Valix asked, determined to contribute. "You," Johnson said with respect in his voice, "will be the face of this effort. Your story, told in your words. No political angle, no manipulation, just the truth about what happened and the impact of this closure on your family." Valix felt a flutter of anxiety. "I'm not sure I can do that. Public speaking isn't easy for me." She gestured at her trembling secondary limbs. "Those tremors," Rodriguez said gently, "are part of your story. They don't diminish you. They show what you've overcome." There's strength in that vulnerability, Valix. Before she could respond, Cole's communication device chimed. He checked it, his expression registering surprise. We've got movement. The station director's office just announced they'll be holding a public hearing on recent vendor closures. Tomorrow morning. Johnson's eyebrows rose. That was fast. Our contacts must have applied more pressure than I anticipated. Or, Rodriguez suggested, her expression thoughtful. Someone else is trying to get ahead of this situation. As if on cue, Valix's own device activated with an incoming message. It was a formal notification. Her family's presence was requested at the hearing as the primary complainants. It's happening, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. We're really doing this. Johnson placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, careful to avoid her sensitive, secondary limbs. We are. And whatever happens, you won't face it alone. For the first time in years, Valix felt a sensation that had become almost foreign to her. Genuine hope, not for escape from her condition, but for justice. It was a powerful feeling, and it steadied her trembling limbs, if only for a moment. The public hearing was scheduled for 0900 station time in the Central Civic Hall, a space normally reserved for major announcements and ceremonial functions. By 0830, the hall was already filled beyond capacity, with beings of dozens of species crowding the seats and standing areas. At the front, a raised platform held a long table where 7 administrators representing the station's executive council sat, their expressions uniformly grave. Valix and her parents were directed to seats in the front row, directly facing the council. The 3 human veterans sat beside them, Johnson and Rodriguez in full dress uniform, Cole in civilian attire, but with his service medals prominently displayed on his jacket. The symbolism was clear. They stood with the Ceruleans as allies, not merely observers. To their right, another section of seats held the Draconid delegation, Ambassador Krelvax, 2 aides, and, notably, his son Drexel and the other 3 young Draconids from the food court incident. Drexel looked distinctly uncomfortable, his scales an unhealthy pale hue that suggested stress or fear. His father's expression was unreadable, a diplomat's mask of professional neutrality. At precisely 0900, Station Director Helith, a statuesque meridian with opalescent skin and 6 eyes arranged in a semicircle around her elongated head, rose to address the assembly. This hearing has been convened to address concerns regarding the application of commercial regulations on Nexus Station, she announced, her melodic voice carrying easily through the hall without technological amplification. Specifically, we will examine allegations of discriminatory enforcement against vendors from non-concordat worlds. She gestured to the Cerulean family. The case of Tavex family provisions will serve as our primary focus, as recent events have brought particular attention to their situation. The director's gaze swept over the assembly. I must emphasize that Nexus Station exists as a neutral trading hub, where beings of all species and political affiliations can conduct business without fear of prejudice or harassment. Any action that undermines this principle threatens the very foundation of our shared enterprise. She then outlined the format for the hearing. The station's commercial enforcement officer would present the official reasons for the closure, followed by statements from the affected vendor and any other relevant parties. The council would then deliberate and render a decision. Administrator Kael Vec, who had delivered the closure notice to Valix's family, approached the podium. His gelatinous form seemed even more agitated than usual within his environment suit. The temporary suspension of License C for 7293, held by Tavex Family Provisions, was initiated following receipt of a formal complaint regarding food safety practices. He began, his translated voice flat and mechanical. Specifically, concerns were raised about the primary food handler's physical condition and its potential impact on sanitation standards. A murmur ran through the crowd at this blatant reference to Valix's tremors. Even some council members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Kael Vec continued, seemingly oblivious to the reaction. While no actual violations were documented, procedure dictates that all formal complaints must be investigated before operations can resume. The estimated timeline for such investigations is typically 7 to 10 standard cycles. Director Helith interjected. Was this timeline consistent with previous similar investigations? Kielvek hesitated, his appendages writhing nervously. It is, within the allowable range specified by regulations. That wasn't the question, Administrator, the director pressed. Is this timeline consistent with previous cases? No, Kielvek admitted reluctantly. The average resolution time for similar complaints over the past solar year has been 2.3 cycles. Another murmur, louder this time, rippled through the assembly. And who filed the complaint that led to this closure? The director asked. Kielvek's discomfort was now palpable. Regulations protect the confidentiality of complainants. In normal circumstances, yes, Director Helleth cut in. But given the public nature of this hearing and the allegations of discriminatory enforcement, the council has voted to waive that protection. Who filed the complaint, Administrator? After a moment of silence, Kielvek responded. The complaint was filed by Trade Envoy Krelvax of the Draconid Imperium. All eyes turned to the Draconid ambassador, who remained impassive despite now being the center of attention. His son, however, couldn't maintain such composure. Drexel's scales flushed darker with what appeared to be a mixture of embarrassment and anger. Director Helleth thanked Kielvek, who seemed relieved to step away from the podium. We will now hear from Tavek's Family Provisions, who will be speaking on behalf of the establishment. Valix felt a moment of panic as her father began to rise from his seat. This was the expected protocol. The legal owner would represent the business. But something inside her rebelled against remaining silent. This was her story too, perhaps more hers than anyone's. Before she could second-guess herself, Valix stood up. I will speak, she said, her voice stronger than she had anticipated. Her parents looked surprised, but didn't object. Johnson gave her an encouraging nod as she made her way to the podium, aware of hundreds of eyes following her progress, many focused on her visibly trembling secondary limbs. As she faced the assembly, Valix felt an initial wave of terror. Public speaking had always been difficult for her. Her condition tended to worsen under stress, and the tremors in her secondary limbs would become more pronounced, drawing unwanted attention and pity. But today, for the first time, she didn't try to hide them. Instead, she placed all 6 of her arms on the podium, the secondary ones continuing their constant, involuntary movements. My name is Valix, she began, her voice initially soft, but gaining strength with each word. I was born with a neural condition that affects the control of my secondary limbs. On my homeworld, this made me an outcast. When economic sanctions forced my family to flee, we came to Nexus Station because we believed the Charter's promise of equal treatment for all beings, regardless of species, political affiliation, or physical difference. She paused, making eye contact with various members of the audience before continuing. 2 days ago, 4 Draconid youths came to our stall. They called me defective. They said I shouldn't be allowed in public spaces. They slapped me and mocked my condition. Her voice remained steady despite the painful recollection. This wasn't the first time I'd faced such treatment, but it was the first time anyone had intervened. Valix gestured toward Johnson, Rodriguez, and Cole. These humans, strangers who owed me nothing, stood up for me when station security wouldn't. They didn't use violence. They didn't threaten. They simply refused to look away from injustice. The hall was utterly silent now, every being focused on her words. The next day, our stall was closed on a pretext. We were told it might be weeks before we could reopen, weeks without income, weeks that would destroy everything my parents have built here. Valix's secondary limbs trembled more violently, but she no longer felt shame for it. Now we learn that the very person who filed the complaint that closed our stall is the father of one of my harassers. She looked directly at Ambassador Krelvax. I don't blame you for wanting to protect your son, but using official power to punish those your child has harmed isn't protection, it's abuse of authority. It teaches exactly the wrong lesson about privilege and responsibility. Turning back to the council, Valix continued. This isn't just about my family's stall. We've learned that other small vendors from non-Concordat worlds have been similarly targeted. This pattern suggests a systematic effort to drive out independent businesses that don't align with Concordat interests. Valix took a deep breath before her conclusion. Nexus Station claims to be a neutral hub where all species can coexist and trade fairly. If that's true, then what happened to my family cannot be allowed to stand. Not just for our sake, but for the integrity of everything this station claims to represent. As she stepped away from the podium, the silence held for a moment before applause began to ripple through the assembly, growing in volume until it filled the hall. Director Helith made no attempt to quiet it, allowing the response to run its natural course. When the applause finally subsided, the director spoke again. "Thank you for your courage, Valix. Would anyone else like to address the council regarding this matter?" To everyone's surprise, Ambassador Krelvax rose from his seat. "I would speak," he announced, his deep voice resonating through the hall. As the Draconid diplomat approached the podium, the atmosphere in the room tensed. Valix felt Johnson place a reassuring hand on her shoulder as she returned to her seat. Krelvax cut an imposing figure at the podium, his scaled form draped in the formal diplomatic attire of the Imperium. When he spoke, his voice was measured and controlled. "Director Helith, honored council members, residents of Nexus Station," he began. "I stand before you to address certain inaccuracies in the narrative that has developed around recent events." A low murmur of discontent ran through the crowd, but Krelvax continued undeterred. "It is true that I filed a formal complaint regarding Tavex family provisions. It is also true that my son and his associates were involved in an altercation with the young cerulean Valix." He paused, his tail swaying slightly in what appeared to be discomfort. "What has not been acknowledged is that my complaint was filed before I became aware of my son's involvement." The murmuring grew louder at this claim. Even the council members exchanged skeptical glances. Furthermore, Krelvax continued, "While I maintain that all health regulations should be strictly enforced on Nexus Station, I must concede that the recommended timeline for investigation in this case appears disproportionate compared to similar cases." He straightened to his full, impressive height. "As a representative of the Draconid Imperium, I am authorized to make the following statement. We withdraw our complaint against Tavex family provisions, effective immediately. Furthermore, we request that the Council expedite the reinstatement of their operating license." The hall erupted in surprised conversation. This unexpected concession from the Draconid ambassador left many speechless, including Valix and her parents. But Krelvax wasn't finished. In a move that shocked the assembly further, he gestured for his son to join him at the podium. Drexel approached reluctantly, his scales now an ashen color that indicated extreme distress. "My son has something to say as well," Krelvax announced, stepping aside to allow the young Draconid access to the microphone. Drexel stood frozen for a moment, clearly uncomfortable with the public scrutiny. When he finally spoke, his voice lacked its usual arrogance. "I wish to apologize," he said stiffly, the words obviously rehearsed. "My behavior toward Valix was inappropriate and does not reflect the diplomatic values of the Imperium." The apology was clearly forced, lacking sincerity, but the very fact that it was happening at all was remarkable. In Draconid culture, public apologies were extremely rare, especially from members of the upper castes. Drexel continued, still not making eye contact with Valix or anyone else. "As restitution, my companions and I will personally cover any lost revenue resulting from the stall's closure, as calculated by Station Financial Services." With that, he quickly retreated from the podium, returning to his seat without waiting for acknowledgement. His father remained a moment longer. The Draconid Imperium values its relationship with Nexus Station and all species represented here. Krelvax concluded smoothly, once again the consummate diplomat. "We trust this resolution satisfies all parties and allows us to move forward productively." As he returned to his seat, Director Helith called for a brief recess to allow the council to deliberate. The assembly hall buzzed with conversation as various beings discussed this unexpected turn of events. At their seats, Valix and her family were still processing what had happened. "I don't understand," her father whispered. "Why the sudden reversal?" Johnson leaned in, keeping his voice low. "Politics." The footage of their original harassment went viral. The Imperium couldn't afford the public relations damage, especially with trade negotiations ongoing with several neutral worlds. Rodriguez nodded in agreement. "They're cutting their losses. Better a small public embarrassment now than a prolonged scandal that could affect major diplomatic initiatives." "Will it work?" Valix asked, still somewhat stunned by the developments. Cole smiled. For them? Partially. For you? Completely. You're going to get your stall back, plus compensation. And if I'm reading the room correctly, your business is about to boom. He was right. When the council returned from deliberation, their decision was unanimous. Tavex Family Provisions would have its license reinstated immediately, with a formal apology from the station administration for the procedural irregularities in the case. Furthermore, the council announced a comprehensive review of all vendor closures over the past 6 months to identify any patterns of discriminatory enforcement. As the hearing concluded, beings from throughout the station approached Valix and her family to express support and promise future patronage. The 3 human veterans stood nearby, declining credit for their role, but clearly pleased with the outcome. For Valix, the experience was surreal. Where once she had tried to make herself invisible, now she was the center of positive attention. Her secondary limbs still trembled, they always would, but somehow that no longer seemed like the most important thing about her. Later that day, as they prepared to reopen their stall, Valix found a moment alone with Johnson, Rodriguez, and Cole. I don't know how to thank you, she said simply. You changed everything. Johnson shook his head. We just created an opportunity. You're the one who stood up and spoke your truth in front of the entire station. That took more courage than anything we did in uniform. What happens now? Valix asked. The Draconids apologized publicly, but I doubt they've changed their views. And you 3 will be leaving soon. Rodriguez smiled. Now, you keep doing what you've always done, living your life, running your business. But maybe with a little more confidence. And as for us leaving, Cole added, that doesn't mean we're gone for good. The Dauntless makes regular stops at Nexus. We'll be back. Besides, Johnson said with a wink, we've developed a taste for those sweet spice rolls. Can't get them anywhere else in the sector. Valix laughed, a sound she realized had been rare in recent years. There will always be a fresh batch waiting for you on the house. As they walked together toward the food court, Valix felt lighter than she had in years. The tremors in her secondary limbs continued their familiar dance, but they no longer seemed like shackles binding her to shame and isolation. Instead, they were simply part of who she was, not her whole story, but a chapter in a much larger narrative that was still being written. The reopening of Tavex Family Provisions drew a crowd that spilled out of the food court and into the main concourse. Beings from dozens of species lined up to sample cerulean cuisine, many openly expressing support for Valix and her family. The humans stood nearby, declining interviews from curious media but maintaining a watchful presence. From across the food court, Drexel and his friends observed the scene, their earlier arrogance replaced by sullen resignation. Their humiliation had been public and complete. Whatever lessons they took from the experience remained to be seen, but for now, at least, they kept their distance. Valix moved through the crowd with newfound confidence, her secondary limbs still trembling but no longer hidden. Each time she felt a moment of self-consciousness, she remembered the humans who had shown her that standing up for what was right sometimes meant standing out. As the artificial day cycle of Nexus Station began to dim toward evening, signaling the end of another rotation, Valix looked out at the stars visible through the massive viewport at the end of the concourse. Somewhere out there, Earth was spinning, home to a species that had arrived late to the galactic community but had brought with them principles worth defending. She turned back to her stall, where her parents were busy serving customers and Johnson, Rodriguez, and Cole were engaged in animated conversation with beings from half a dozen different worlds. The veterans' shore leave would end eventually, and they would return to their duties. The Draconids would continue their diplomatic maneuvering. Life on Nexus Station would go on. But something fundamental had changed, not just for Valix and her family, but perhaps for the station itself. A small incident involving a disabled alien girl and 3 human veterans had cracked the veneer of political expediency that had allowed injustice to flourish in shadows. Light had entered through that crack, and in its illumination, a better path forward had become visible. Valix picked up a tray of freshly prepared samples, her trembling secondary limbs managing the task with practiced skill. As she moved toward the waiting customers, she held her head high. The tremors would always be with her, But so too would the memory of the day when Bullies slapped a disabled alien girl, and an hour later, human veterans walked in and changed everything. In the weeks that followed, life on Nexus Station settled into a new normal. Tavek's family provisions thrived, with customers often lining up before the stall opened each morning. The promised compensation from the Draconids had been paid promptly, allowing Valix's family to upgrade their equipment and even hire additional help during peak hours. More significantly, the Council's review of vendor closures had uncovered a clear pattern of discriminatory enforcement against businesses from non-concordat worlds. Several administrators, including Kale Vec, had been reassigned pending further investigation. New regulatory oversight committees had been established, with representation from all species groups on the station. For Valix personally, the changes were even more profound. Her story had resonated across multiple worlds, inspiring others with various conditions to advocate for themselves. She had begun receiving messages from ceruleans with similar neural disorders, many of whom had lived in isolation and shame. These connections were healing something in Valix that she hadn't realized was wounded, her sense of belonging to a community beyond her immediate family. The Draconid youths had kept their distance, though occasionally Valix would spot Drexel watching her from afar, his expression unreadable. Whatever thoughts or feelings churned behind his scaled features remained his own. His father, Ambassador Krelvax, had returned to his diplomatic duties, the incident apparently closed from the Imperium's perspective. As for the human veterans, they had indeed departed on the Dauntless when their shore leave ended. But true to their word, they stayed in contact. Johnson sent regular messages checking on Valix and her family's welfare. Rodriguez provided useful information about trade regulations and diplomatic developments that might affect their business. And Cole, the youngest and most impulsive of the three, sent lighthearted updates about life aboard the Dauntless along with creative recipe suggestions that fused human and cerulean culinary traditions. 3 months after the incident, Valix stood at the viewport in their now expanded living quarters, watching as a human military vessel docked at Nexus Station. The Dauntless had returned, right on schedule. Soon, Johnson, Rodriguez, and Cole would walk through the station corridors, perhaps heading directly to the food court for those sweet spice rolls they claimed to miss so much. Valix smiled at the thought, her secondary limbs moving in their perpetual dance. She no longer tried to still them or hide them. They were part of her, like her blue skin or her luminous eyes. The neural consultation on Centauri Prime was still in her future. Her parents had insisted on saving the money despite the improved business, but whether it helped control her tremors or not, Valix had made peace with herself. As she prepared to head to the family stall for her shift, Valix caught her reflection in the polished surface of the viewport. The face that looked back at her was changed from the frightened girl who had cowered before Draconid bullies. There was strength there now, and purpose, not despite her difference, but alongside it. She thought about what Johnson had said during their last conversation before the Dauntless departed. Courage isn't the absence of fear, Valix. It's feeling the fear and standing your ground anyway. You've got more courage than most soldiers I've served with. The words had stayed with her, a touchstone during moments of doubt. She wasn't fearless, far from it. But she had learned that fear didn't have to define her actions or limit her possibilities. As Valix made her way through the busy corridors of Nexus Station, many beings nodded in greeting or called her by name. Where once she had tried to make herself invisible, now she moved with confidence, returning greetings and engaging in brief conversations. Arriving at the food court, she spotted them immediately, Johnson, Rodriguez, and Cole, still in their travel uniforms, scanning the area. When Cole saw her, his face lit up with a grin, and he waved enthusiastically. Valix raised all 6 arms in response, her secondary limbs moving in their uncontrolled patterns. But the movement no longer brought shame. It was simply her way of waving, unique to her. As she approached her friends, Valix reflected on how a single moment of intervention had cascaded into transformative change. The humans hadn't solved all her problems or eradicated prejudice from Nexus Station. What they had done was far more important. They had shown her that she was worth standing up for, that her dignity mattered. And in doing so, they had helped her discover her own voice and the courage to use it. The lesson wasn't lost on others who had witnessed the events. Throughout Nexus Station, small acts of intervention and solidarity had become more common. Beings who might once have looked away from injustice now more frequently spoke up. The change wasn't universal or complete. Prejudice and cruelty still existed, but a standard had been set, an example provided. As Valix reached the three veterans, they exchanged greetings that had evolved from formal to warmly familiar over their communications. "How's business?" Johnson asked, his eyes taking in the bustling food court and the line already forming at the cerulean stall despite the early hour. "Never better," Valix replied truthfully. "Father's talking about opening a second location on the upper concourse." Rodriguez smiled. "Not surprising. Your story's still making the rounds in diplomatic circles. You've become something of a symbol." Valix shook her head, still uncomfortable with that characterization. "I never wanted to be a symbol. I just wanted to be treated like anyone else." Sometimes, Cole observed with unexpected wisdom, the people who make the biggest difference are the ones who never set out to change anything but themselves. Johnson clapped the younger man on the shoulder with approval. "When did you get so philosophical, Cole?" "Must be all those sweet spice rolls," Cole replied with a grin. "Speaking of which," Valix laughed. "Already prepared. My parents are expecting you. They've been cooking special dishes all morning in anticipation of your return." As they walked together toward the stall, Valix noticed Drexel and one of his friends entering the food court from the opposite side. The young Draconid spotted her immediately, then noticed her human companions. For a moment, he seemed about to retreat, but then, surprisingly, he changed course and approached them. Johnson tensed slightly, but Valix placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "It's okay," she said softly. "Let's see what he wants." Drexel stopped a respectful distance away, his posture formal but no longer aggressive. "Valix," he acknowledged with a slight nod. "I heard your business is doing well." "It is," she confirmed, neither friendly nor hostile. "Thank you for asking." An awkward silence followed before Drexel spoke again. "My father has been assigned to a diplomatic mission to Earth. I will be accompanying him." He paused, seeming to struggle with his next words. "He suggested I should learn more about human culture before we depart." Valix understood what wasn't being said. This was as close to a genuine apology as Draconid pride would allow. She glanced at her human friends, raising her eyebrows in silent question. Johnson considered the young Draconid for a long moment before responding. "There's no better way to learn about a culture than through its food," he said finally. "We were just about to have a meal with Valix and her family. You're welcome to join us, if that's acceptable to all parties." Valix nodded her agreement, her secondary limbs moving in what those who knew her would recognize as a pattern indicating cautious optimism. Drexel looked genuinely surprised by the invitation. "I would be honored," he said, with none of his former arrogance. As they made their way to the cerulean stall, where Valix's parents were already setting out an impressive array of dishes, she reflected on the unexpected paths that life could take. From isolation to connection, from victimhood to advocacy, from shame to acceptance. The tremors in her secondary limbs continued, as they always would, but they no longer defined her existence. 3 years later, Valix stood proudly at the grand opening of their third location on Nexus Station. The neural treatments on Centauri Prime had helped reduce her tremors slightly, but more importantly, she had fully embraced herself as she was. Her family's business had become a symbol of resilience and change throughout the station. Drexel's diplomatic mission to Earth had transformed him. The arrogant youth had returned with a newfound respect for humans and their values. Today, as the newly appointed junior ambassador, he was attending the ceremony not out of obligation, but genuine support. Johnson, Rodriguez, and Cole made their way through the crowd to congratulate her. The three veterans had become regular visitors to Nexus, with Cole even accepting a permanent position as human liaison to the station's security force. "You did all this," Valix told them, embracing each in turn. "No," Johnson corrected gently. "You did this yourself. We just happened to walk in at the right time." As the celebration continued around them, Valix realized that what had begun as a terrible moment of humiliation had transformed into something powerful. The story of a disabled alien girl and the human veterans who stood for her had spread across dozens of worlds, inspiring countless others to intervene when they witnessed injustice. To unexpected friendships, Rodriguez proposed, raising her glass in toast. Everyone joined, including Drexel, who had learned that true strength came not from dominating others, but from standing beside them in solidarity. That night, as Valix looked out at the stars beyond the station, she felt complete. Her secondary limbs still trembled, but they now moved with purpose, preparing specialties that beings traveled across sectors to experience. Her difference had become her signature. The universe remained imperfect, filled with prejudice and cruelty, but also with those willing to stand against it. Sometimes, all it took was a few good people refusing to look away when someone vulnerable needed help. And that was the end of the story. If you listened all the way to here, don't forget to leave feedback about what you thought of the story in the comments, whether positive or negative. Your feedback helps us improve. Also, leave your like and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this one. And I'll leave here on the screen another video that I'm sure you'll like. Big hug, and see you in the next story.